Everyone thinks moving into a new apartment is exciting, but for Harper, Miles, their new roommate Soren, it quickly turned into a nightmare. At first, Soren seemed polite, almost too perfect. But soon, strange things began happening. Whispers in the dark, shadows moving on their own, and small black-eyed figures appearing where they shouldn't. What started as a normal shared living situation became a twisted game, and Harper and Miles realized far too late that the apartment and Soren were far more dangerous than they ever could have imagined. I moved into the apartment feeling relieved that I had finally found a place I could afford. It was small, but the rent was cheap, and the location was perfect for my job. My new roommate, Jake, seemed normal enough when I first met him. He smiled easily, carried himself casually, and made a few polite jokes. I felt a flicker of hope that living with someone wouldn't be unbearable, but there was something about the way he held his apartment key, gripping it like it was a shield, that made me uneasy. It wasn't the key itself, it was the tension in his fingers, the way his knuckles widened even when he was unlocking the door. The first few days were calm. Jake went about his routine quietly, and I did the same. He seemed to like spending time in his room, headphones on, scribbling on sheets of paper that I never dared to look at. Sometimes, I would catch a glimpse of him staring into the dark corner of his room, as if he expected someone or something to be there. I told myself it was normal. People had quirks, right? I tried to push the feeling aside, but then came the smell. At first I thought it was food left out too long, but it lingered, a sour, rotting stench that seemed to cling to the walls themselves. I cleaned the kitchen repeatedly, scrubbed the floors, but the smell didn't leave. It stayed, faint but undeniable, and sometimes I thought I could smell it even when I left the apartment. The first night I noticed something truly wrong. I woke to whispering. It was soft at first, almost gentle, but the tone was wrong. It was urgent, demanding, as if it carried a message meant only for someone else. I told myself it was the wind brushing against the old window panes, that it was just the building settling. But when I listened closer, I realized the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the living room. My heart hammered in my chest as I peered through the crack of my bedroom door. Shadows shifted across the floor, dark and amorphous, and in the middle of them stood Jake. But he wasn't alone. The shadows moved unnaturally, stretching and curling, as if alive. They twisted around him, almost welcoming him, or perhaps controlling him. I blinked, and the shadows were gone. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the dim light, a product of my imagination, but then I saw the figurines. When I opened the fridge to grab water, there they were, lined up neatly on the counter, small, human-shaped figures, their faces featureless, except for blackened eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I froze. My mind raced. Were they toys? Some kind of art project? The details were disturbingly precise, almost lifelike, and their presence made my skin crawl. I slammed the fridge shut, and the whispering returned louder, clearer, as though it had been waiting for me to notice. I could hear the syllables, but they didn't make sense. The voice wasn't human, not really. It was hollow, dragging, with an echo that seemed to come from inside my own skull. Sleep that night was impossible. Every creak in the apartment sounded like footsteps approaching my bedroom. The shadows seemed to move even when I closed my eyes, slithering along the edges of my vision. My own reflection in the dark window looked strange, distorted, as though my face wasn't quite my own. I tried to tell myself it was exhaustion, that moving and settling into a new place could play tricks on the mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The air in the apartment felt thick, almost alive, pressing down on my chest, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I didn't see Jake that night, but I knew he was there. I could feel him, a presence at the edge of the shadows, observing, waiting. And then I noticed the faint markings on the walls, strange scratches that hadn't been there before, almost like tally marks or symbols etched into the plaster. They were small, delicate, and arranged in patterns I didn't understand. My stomach churned as I realized these markings were recent. They were meant to be seen by someone, by me. When morning finally came, I tried to pretend nothing had happened, brushing off the fear like a bad dream. But the figurines remained, perfectly lined on the counter, their black eyes unwavering, unblinking, and I couldn't shake the whispering from the night. The sense that something in that apartment had noticed me, had marked me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had to be. But deep in my chest, a cold dread settled in. Something about Jake wasn't normal. Something about this apartment wasn't normal. And as I left for work that morning, I felt the eyes of the figurines follow me, as if they knew I had seen too much. After that night, I tried to ignore the feeling that I was being watched, but it only grew stronger. Everywhere I went in the apartment, I could feel its ties following me from the shadows, a weight pressing against my back when I moved from room to room. Jake went about his routine as if nothing had happened, calm and casual in the daylight, laughing at shows, scrolling through his phone, acting like a normal roommate. But at night, everything changed. His laughter vanished, replaced by soft muttering, low tones that didn't make sense, words I couldn't recognize. I never saw what he was doing with the scraps of paper he scribbled on in the dim light, but I noticed that the pile grew steadily, stacked neatly in a drawer he always kept locked from the outside world. I started staying awake late at night, unable to sleep, my mind twisting over the whispers and shadows I had witnessed. One night I was scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself, when I caught movement in the reflection of the window. Jake was standing behind me, or at least, his reflection was. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart thudded in my chest, my palms sweating. Yet, when I looked back at the window, the reflection remained. My stomach dropped as I realized his eyes and the reflection weren't normal. They were dark, endless voids, sucking in the light, staring straight through me. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and the reflection disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the dull glow of the streetlights outside. The next few nights were worse. I could hear scratching coming from the walls, soft at first, then louder, like fingernails dragging along the plaster. It moved slowly through the apartment, stopping just outside my bedroom door. My breath caught in my throat as I held perfectly still, trying not to make a sound. Then came the whispering, louder, closer, right at my ear. The voice wasn't human. It was guttural, dragging, speaking words that I could barely understand, but I knew they were my name. It called me, over and over, until I felt a panic I had never known before, my chest tightening, my hands trembling. I forced myself to open the door, trembling from head to toe, but the hallway was empty. I began noticing small things missing. At first it was trivial. My keys, a pair of socks, my favorite mug. I thought I had misplaced them, but soon the pattern became too obvious to ignore. My possessions were vanishing, and in their place, small black-eyed figurines appeared. I found them in impossible places, on top of the fridge, under the couch, even in my bed. Each one stared at me with the same hollow, unblinking gaze. I tried moving them out of the apartment, throwing them in the trash, but the next morning they were always back, lined up neatly in my room like sentinels watching me. Sleep became a nightmare. Every creak in the apartment sounded amplified, like someone walking right beside me. The shadows moved in ways they shouldn't, stretching along walls and ceiling corners, twisting into shapes that resembled limbs and faces that weren't human. My reflection became stranger to. I would glance at myself in the mirror and notice subtle differences, my eyes darker, my expression subtly altered, my features shifting in ways I couldn't quite identify. It was as though I was already becoming part of something else, something not entirely me. The final straw came one night when I woke to the sound of breathings, low, deliberate, and not my own. I pressed my ear to the wall and realized it wasn't coming from any particular direction. It was everywhere. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin, heavy and humid, filled with a low vibration that made my teeth ache. I stumbled to the kitchen, desperate for any rational explanation, and froze when I saw the figurine on the counter. It was new, different from the others. Its black eyes glimmered with something almost alive, and I could swear it was smiling. My hands shook as I reached for it, but when I touched it, it was cold and heavy, heavier than it should have been for something so small. That was when I realized Jake wasn't the only one in the apartment. Whatever he had brought with him, whatever those figurines represented, they were watching me, feeding off me, waiting. And the whispering didn't stop. It grew louder, forming words I could almost understand, promising things I didn't want, threatening things I couldn't imagine. My chest tightened, my vision blurred, and I sank to the floor, paralyzed by fear. As I lay there trembling, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The shadows in the corners of the kitchen were not just shadows anymore. They were moving on their own, stretching toward me, curling and twisting like living tendrils, and in the middle of them, Jake stood perfectly still, his eyes as black as the figurine, staring directly at me with a smile that didn't reach his face. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused. I realized then, with a sinking certainty, that nothing in this apartment was normal, and nothing in this apartment was safe. The last thing I saw that night before the shadows swallowed the light around me was one of the figurines slowly turning toward me, its black eyes gleaming with intent as if it knew exactly what I feared the most. By the third week of living with Jake, the apartment no longer felt like a home. It felt like a cage. Small things kept disappearing, my keys, my wallet, even the few clothes I had left in the closet, but it wasn't just objects. I started noticing changes in myself. I felt drained, as if my energy was being pulled out of me while I slept. My reflection looked wrong sometimes, my eyes darker, my skin paler, and I could swear the corners of my mouth twitched when I wasn't looking. One morning, I woke to a pile of hair in the bathtub, dark and matted. The water was stained a deep brown, almost red, and a nauseating smell lingered in the air. I gagged, backing away, but the hair seemed deliberate. It had been collected, arranged, almost like a warning. I couldn't bring myself to confront Jake, though I wanted to scream at him, demand answers. There was something about him, something in the way he moved, the way he watched me from the shadows that made me freeze in fear. His calm, almost pleasant demeanor during the day was a mask, and I felt trapped behind a glass wall I couldn't break through. I started staying awake at night, watching him from my room. Through the crack in my door, I saw him whispering to the shadows, He held my missing items in his hands, my favorite mug, my notebook, even a pair of socks, and muttered over them before placing them into a small wooden box I had never noticed before. The box seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. I could feel a low vibration in my chest, a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and I realized with horror that the box was somehow connected to me. The sounds in the apartment grew worse. Scratching came from the walls, soft at first, then wet, as if claws were dragging through the plaster. Whispers followed me wherever I went, echoing off the walls, sometimes repeating my own thoughts back to me, sometimes saying things I didn't want to hear. One night I pressed my ear to the wall in desperation, hoping to understand what was happening. I heard breathing, deep, guttural, unnatural, not mine, not Jake's, but something else entirely. Responding to the rhythm of his muttering, I staggered back, my stomach twisting. I tried to leave. I packed my bag quietly, planning to slip out while Jake was distracted, but every door I tried was stuck, locked, unyielding. The apartment seemed to shift, as if it were alive, moving to trap me inside. Even the windows refused to open, sealed tight as if mocking my attempts to escape. My panic grew, my chest tightening with every heartbeat. And then I noticed the figurines. They were everywhere now, lining the walls, perched on shelves, even in my bed. Each one stared at me, black-eyed and unblinking. And I realized they were not just objects, they were watching, tracking, waiting. The night stretched endlessly. Shadows thickened in corners, stretching along the ceiling, curling like tendrils reaching for me. I tried to scream, but my voice failed me. My reflection in the dark windows stared back at me, but it wasn't me. Its eyes were hollow, black, and its mouth moved on its own, whispering words I couldn't understand. I wanted to run, but I felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. My body betrayed me, refusing to respond as the apartment seemed to tighten around me, closing in like a living thing. I watched Jake closely, noticing how the shadows obeyed him, bending and twisting around his form. One night, he knelt in a circle in the living room, the wooden box in front of him. From beneath the floorboards, something stirred, something alive. The air pulsed with a heartbeat that matched mine, slow and deliberate, and I realized with horror that whatever he was feeding, whatever he was conjuring, it was drawing from me. The room itself seemed to shiver, walls vibrating, shadows writhing like snakes. I wanted to leave, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The apartment had become a trap, and I was the prey. Then came the last straw. I woke to find scratches across my arms, deep and red, and a figurine on my pillow, its black eyes staring directly into mine. I didn't touch it. I didn't move. I could only lie there, paralyzed as a low whisper filled the room, circling me, promising things I didn't want, threatening things I couldn't imagine. And in the corner of my vision, I saw Jake's shadow stretching impossibly, moving toward me as if it were alive, separate from him, feeding on the fear I couldn't contain. I realized then, fully, that the apartment was no longer a place I lived, and it was a place I was imprisoned. A dark ecosystem feeding on my terror. I stayed awake the entire night, heart racing, mind screaming, unable to escape the presence of Jake and whatever dark force had taken root in that apartment. And when morning came, the shadows didn't leave, the figurines didn't disappear. The air still thrummed with a pulse that matched my own, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was only the beginning. The worst was yet to come. By the time the fourth week rolled around, I realized that I could no longer ignore the truth. The apartment wasn't just strange, it was alive, and Jake wasn't just my roommate. Whatever he was, he controlled it, bending shadows and whispers to his will. I had thought about confronting him, leaving, calling for help, but every attempt felt impossible. The doors were locked. The windows refused to open. Even my phone seemed compromised. Sometimes the screen flickered, showing images that weren't mine. Whispers crackling through the speaker when I hadn't touched it. I felt trapped, and worse, I knew deep down that the apartment itself didn't want me to leave. One night I finally decided to make a desperate attempt. I packed a small bag quietly, slipping socks, toiletries, and a change of clothes inside, hoping to escape while Jake was occupied in his room. As I tiptoed toward the front door, I realized the lock had changed. The key in my hand didn't fit. My pulse quickened. I tried the windows, and they too were sealed tight, cold metal refusing to give way. I pressed my face against the glass, hoping someone outside would notice my panic, but the streets were empty, the building silent. I felt the air thicken around me, pressing into my lungs, making it hard to breathe. Then I saw him. Jake appeared behind me, calm, unnervingly calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. His eyes weren't human anymore. They were black voids, deep and endless, pulling at the edges of my mind. His smile was slow, deliberate, and it didn't reach the corners of his face. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my feet wouldn't move. He raised a hand, impossibly long and thin, and it brushed my shoulder. The touch felt icy, like a frozen knife cutting through my skin, and my vision blurred. Shadows in the corners of the apartment began to writhe, moving independently, stretching toward me like living tendrils. The figurines multiplied, dozens more appearing from nowhere, lining the walls, their black eyes focused on me. The whispers returned, louder this time, circling my head, repeating words I didn't understand but felt in my bones. Something deep in the apartment pulsed with life, vibrating through the floors, walls, and ceiling. And I realized with horror that it was feeding on me, on my fear, my terror, my very essence. I stumbled backward, pressed against the wall, trying to gather my thoughts. That's when I noticed the floorboards in the living room shifting, a faint rippling movement. Something beneath them was moving, writhing, pulsating, responding to Jake's whispered commands. The wooden box in the center of the circle seemed to throb with a heartbeat of its own, synchronizing with the creature beneath the floor. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to escape, but the apartment had become a labyrinth, a trap designed to keep me exactly where I was. In a moment of desperate courage, I darted to the bedroom, hoping to barricade myself, but the door slammed shut before I could reach it, as if the apartment itself had seized control. Shadows followed me, pressing along the walls, creeping across the ceiling, and the figurines turned in unison to face me. Their black eyes gleamed in the dim light, unblinking, unyielding, and I felt the undeniable truth settle in my chest. I wasn't living here anymore. I was prey. Jake knelt in the center of the living room, still muttering, still feeding the dark force beneath the floorboards. The shadows wrapped around him, stretching toward me like ribbons of smoke, binding me in place. My reflection in the mirror on the wall didn't look like me. Its eyes were hollow, black, and its mouth moved on its own, whispering the same incomprehensible words Jake had been murmuring. I realized with terror that if I didn't escape, even my identity would be consumed, replaced by something unrecognizable, something belonging to the darkness that thrived in that apartment. Then came the final, chilling realization. This wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't a simple spirit or curse. The apartment itself was alive, a dark ecosystem, and Jake was the conductor, the one orchestrating every shadow, every whisper, every figurine. I wasn't trapped by walls or locks. I was trapped by him, by what he had become, and by the thing he was feeding beneath the floor. And as I sank to the floor, paralyzed, I saw one of the figurines move, slowly, deliberately, inching toward me, its black eyes glinting with intent. I knew then that I had crossed a threshold I could never return from. The apartment had chosen me. Jake had marked me, and whatever darkness had been living beneath the floorboards was now aware of me. I wasn't safe in the daylight, I wasn't safe in my own skin, and I wasn't safe in a world where shadows obeyed a man with eyes that were not human. And as the whispers swirled louder, circling my head like vultures, I realized that the true horror hadn't begun yet. It was only waiting for night to fall. I thought I had no choice but to endure it. Every day in that apartment became a nightmare I couldn't escape. Shadows stretched longer, whispers grew louder, and the figurines multiplied. I started avoiding eye contact with Jake altogether, pretending I didn't notice the strange way the shadows moved around him, the way the air seemed heavier whenever he was in a room. But the fear inside me was growing, gnawing at my sanity, and I knew that sooner or later, I had to leave or be consumed entirely. One night I managed to muster enough courage to attempt my escape again. I packed a small bag quietly, holding my breath as I slipped toward the front door. But as soon as I tried the lock, I realized it had changed again. The key I had no longer worked. I shook it, rattled the door, and pressed my ear to the wood. That's when I felt a vibration under my feet, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. It matched my own, perfectly, and I realized with terror that the apartment wasn't just alive, it was synchronized to me. Jake appeared behind me without a sound. His eyes were black voids, endless and deep, pulling at something in my mind that I couldn't fight. His smile was slow and deliberate, calm in a way that made my chest tighten with fear. Shadows twisted around him, stretching toward me like living tendrils. The figurines moved as well, inching closer, their black eyes gleaming with a strange awareness. I wanted to run, to flee into the street, but the apartment had already decided I couldn't. The walls themselves seemed to shift, corridors narrowing, the ceiling lowering, pressing me into place. I tried the windows, desperate for any escape, but they were sealed tight. I tried to scream, but my voice failed me. Every instinct told me to run, yet my body refused to obey. I stumbled back, pressed against the wall, and realized the shadows weren't just following me, they were part of me now. Every movement I made caused them to stretch and twist, binding me tighter, drawing me closer to whatever Jake was feeding beneath the floorboards. I sank to the floor, trembling, watching him kneel in the center of the living room. The wooden box in front of him throbbed, pulsing like a living thing, and the floor beneath it rippled as if something was moving down there. My heart pounded in my chest, synchronized with the pulse from below. The whispers circled me, repeating my own fears back to me, mocking me, shaping me into prey. And then I understood, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, the apartment didn't want to harm me. It wanted to take me, absorb me, make me part of it. And Jake was the instrument, the conductor of this dark symphony. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think. My reflection in the window stared back at me, but it wasn't me. Its eyes were hollow and black, its mouth twisting into a whispering grin that moved on its own. saying words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my bones. I wanted to fight, to resist, but I was already part of the rhythm now, the pulse of the apartment flowing through me. The figurines moved closer, inch by inch, until they surrounded me, their black eyes fixed, unblinking, judging. I realized then that my fate had been sealed the moment I saw them, and there was no turning back. The next morning, I woke on the floor of the living room, but something was different. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Jake was gone, and for a moment I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe he had left, maybe the nightmare was over. But then I noticed the small wooden box in the center of the room. It was open now, empty, but I could feel the pulse inside, me the same rhythm that had haunted me every night, going from within. I stumbled out of the apartment, thinking I had escaped, and ran into the street. The sun was blinding, the air felt different, but the sense of being watched never left. I tried to call the police, but the line rang endlessly. And when it finally connected, a voice whispered from the other end, "You belong here now." I dropped the phone in shock, but it didn't matter. I realized then that it wasn't the apartment that trapped me, it was Jake, and somehow, whatever he had unleashed was inside me now. Days later I returned to the location where the apartment had been. There was nothing there, just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. No windows, no doors, nothing, only the faint, lingering smell of rot. I felt like I was dreaming, except the pulse in my chest reminded me that it was all too real. And then I felt it again, a figurine in my pocket, its black eyes staring into me, unblinking. I hadn't brought it, it had followed me. That night, in my own bedroom, I noticed the shadows moving. The whispers returned, louder, circling me, twisting my thoughts, and in the corner of the room a figure stood, its silhouette familiar but wrong. Its eyes were black voids, its mouth moved on its own, whispering words I didn't understand. I realized then with horror that I wasn't alone. Jake, or something that had once been him, was inside me, inside my home, inside my mind, and the figurine blinked. The last thing I felt before the darkness swallowed me was the unmistakable certainty that this was only the beginning. The apartment, Jake, the shadows, they weren't done with me, and they never would be.